So I'm titling this week, Following Jesus in 21st Century America, but I thought it would be good to kind of review where we've come from. The first week we looked mainly at C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, and we saw that he believes that patriotism or love of country belongs in the fourth love, affectionate love, storge in Greek. It shouldn't be located in agape, or love of God, selfless love, or in Philadelphia, love for the brethren, and it shouldn't be in the area of our passions. But Lewis felt it should be under storge, or affection. And remember, Lewis is writing this right after World War II, when patriotism and even nationalism had been shown for what it really was in this terrible war, now Second World War, European war initially, of nation states that had whipped people into frenzy of nationalism of various kinds. So he's not writing in a vacuum. He's thinking deeply about where patriotism should belong in this order of love. So that was our discussion of the first week. And then last week, we looked at Scripture and the Confessions, and specifically the Barmen Declaration, which is one of the confessions of our Eco-Presbyterian Church, and it's also shared by other Reformed denominations worldwide as a crucial declaration of faith written in 1934 in the midst of the rise of fascism in Germany. And Bonhoeffer and Barth and others wrote this document and signed their names to it, and Barth sent a copy to Adolf Hitler. We know this because Germans keep good records.
And Randy, we just see one line across our screen. I know you're sharing. I don't know if there's anything more.
Oh, okay. You don't see the whole slide?
No, we just see an orange line that says Sunday School Week 3. So I think maybe you have to open the slideshow or do something different.
I suspect what happened, Randy, is that you accidentally shared just a portion of your screen rather than the whole screen.
Okay.
That's the expert there.
Yeah, so if when you start the sharing, it'll give you a choice.
You share the whole screen, yeah.
Yeah, share the whole screen. There we go, that worked.
And then open this. Now you can see it.
Yep.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having tech support right on the call. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of a review of the 2 weeks we've had so far. That our love for Jesus, who is the one Word of God that we must hear and obey, must reign supreme over all other loves. Or what happens naturally to human love is it can become idolatrous, and this can happen in a relationship with another human being. It can become an idolatry if we have no other source of outlet except that one person. And you probably have all seen this, where people get obsessed even with another person, when if they would love their creator through Jesus Christ and have that love be primary, then all the other loves start to make sense. So it's really a problem of the lordship of Jesus Christ, which is what Barth and Bonhoeffer saw intuitively in their context. So let's look then at Bonhoeffer. In 1943, he was, of course, in prison, and he was writing a book called Discipleship in English. And also he was writing a lot of letters and short essays, and he was getting them smuggled out through guards that were sympathetic to him, that he was actually engaging in pastoral care with. So we have quite a bit of material from his time in prison where he was writing, and he was able to have a Bible, of course, and some other books and writing paper. And he was able to smuggle out these documents. But he wrote in 1943, he was asked in a letter that he responded to, how was it possible for the church to sit back and let Hitler seize absolute power? And he said it was the teaching of cheap grace. And he defined cheap grace as the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace, Bonhoeffer wrote, is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, and grace without Jesus Christ. So that's the famous formulation of Bonhoeffer, and he saw that as the real problem in the German church, was the preaching and the teaching of cheap grace. And in his book, Discipleship, he explores in detail the problem of following Christ at a time when so many were enthralled to a seductive earthly Lord. So it's easy to see what went wrong from, looking back 75, 80 years. But it's harder to see what's going on when you're in the middle of it. And so we have to thank God for Bonhoeffer and Barth and others who saw clearly what was happening and had tremendous courage to speak it against it, even at the cost of, in Bonhoeffer's case, at the cost of his life. So in 2021 North America, we live in a time and a culture that not only teaches cheap grace, but praises it. This has been a problem for many years. John Stott used to say that what his observation was of the church, and he saw this around the world, was that that faith was a mile wide and an inch deep. And of course, we need to see the teaching of discipleship be much deeper than an inch. It has to go deeply into our souls, our hearts. It has to affect everything that we do. So what I want to look at, and I'm, obviously I'm going to be looking at this in a very specific way today, but I want to look at what a costly grace model of Christian faith would look like in 21st century America. And especially in how we engage with our political world. And we have a lot of resources here. One that I found very helpful is a book by Dr. John Inazu, who is a professor of law and politics at Washington University in St. Louis. John Inazu is a Japanese-American believer. He serves on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, so I've gotten to know him a bit, and I think he really has, he's really someone we all need to know and follow. He has a wonderful institute called the George Washington Carver Institute at Washington University in St. Louis, and it's a gathering of Christian academics, faculty, doctoral students, and others who are writing and thinking about what it means to be Christians in a pluralistic world. And in his book, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, he says that the end of pluralism is a nightmare for two reasons. Because if we can't figure out how to live with the deep and real differences that divide us, then we're faced with one of two options. The first is anarchy and violence, and the other is a kind of totalitarianism or total control with a reigning orthodoxy. And neither of those is very attractive from the perspective of most Americans. And he goes back and looks at what was the intent of our founders. in terms of pluralism, and especially in terms of religious pluralism. And he believes that the governments must not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. That's what the framers intended. There was no state church ever conceived by those who wrote the Constitution.
Mute.
Are there any questions about that as we dive into this, or do you want to? Shall I keep going?
State church in particular means not like what Germany had, where the state paid the salaries of the clergy.
Exactly. So the European model was state churches, and what our founders saw is therefore they would fight with each other and go to war with each other because they had different religious perspectives, and it was, of course, it was either Catholic. Sometimes it was wars between Catholics and Protestants, but sometimes it was wars between different kinds of Protestants. And so they were horrified by that. They didn't want that sort of thing. So they specifically did not establish a state church and made it clear that freedom of worship in whatever your faith was, and they understood. They had Muslims in this country in the 18th century, and they understood that would mean of course they had Jewish Americans as well. So they understood that would mean pluralism, and they wanted that. And so that's very important. We are not, and never have been, supposed to be a Christian nation. And you've heard that a lot. I'm sure I've heard it a lot in my lifetime. But that wasn't the intent. That's what Inazu and other scholars, I mean, he's a political scientist and an attorney, but that's what historians of the American Revolution have concluded. So let's go on. So in that model of what Inazu and others call chartered pluralism, religious instruction is left to houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. So, for example, this is an interesting story. I've delved into my ancestry a lot in the last 10 years, and one of the people I discovered was my mom's cousin, who lived in Urbana, Illinois, and who was raised by her parents, my mom's aunt and uncle, to be an atheist. And she was very strong, and this was in the 30s and 40s, when she was very active. And what happened in Urbana, Illinois, is that the school district wanted to teach the Bible. They wanted to bring in pastors from Christian churches, and only Christian churches, to teach the Bible to the students. And she sued and won her case. It was it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's a great, it's a ruling that it's worth reading today, because it lays out this perspective of our founders, that religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, to other religious institutions and families, and that the schools, the public schools, are meant to be places of pluralism with rules, chartered pluralism. So it's not good, for example, to teach any religion other than to say, here's what we know about this religion. So you teach classes. I used to do this at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I used to teach classes, university classes, with a friend who was a professor on world religions. And what he would do, which I thought was right, he would teach kind of the principles of understanding interreligious dialogue, and then he would bring in an actual Christian to teach the section on Christianity, and he brought in a Muslim and a Jew to teach those sections. And so he asked me to do the Christian one, and I taught Christianity, full-throated Christianity, and it was a wonderful discussion in this very secular university. And that, I think, is what our founders intended at every level of public education. And it's chartered pluralism. In other words, there's a charter, there's rules, there's ideas that frame our discussion with each other so that it's always civil and constructive. And it allows us to live in civic harmony with each other without sacrificing our theological convictions. But what happens very easily is that there are movements that arise that conflate religious authority with political authority. And what that does is it violates our Lewis and Bonhoeffer's principles, and it ends up leading to the oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of faith. And this is encouraging for the church, I think, to understand this, that we are going to be fine. We've been fine in under every form of government in human history. Doesn't mean that we won't suffer. Jesus didn't promise we wouldn't have persecution, but the church thrives under every kind of governmental system, and it should be fine, especially if we can argue for chartered pluralism and not for our perspective to reign over our fellow citizens. So we have to stand up as Christians against Christian nationalism, especially when it erupts in violence, vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, etc. We don't have second-class faiths in this country. They're all equal under the Constitution, and we should be able to say with our fellow religionists that Christian nationalism is a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. Our faith teaches us that everyone is created in God's image, commands us to love one another, and we live in a great country. We live in a country that is a constitutional democracy. And we don't want a country where Christian nationalism merges Christian and American ideas or identities. We want a country where not where Christianity is privileged by the state. It implies that to be a good American, one must be a Christian American. And what happens under Christian nationalism, just as what happened in Germany, is it often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And we've seen this over and over again in our history. So we need to be clear that we have to reject this ideology. Patriotism is fine, but not nationalism, not allowing that love to move up to one of the other loves. It should stay in that affectionate love. All right, so our faith, our citizenship primarily is in heaven. And then we are also citizens of wherever God has placed us in the world. So we're bound to Christ, not by citizenship, though, but by faith. And we believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism doesn't require us to minimize our religious convictions. In fact, our religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in civic community. So this is the argument of John Inazu, and I'm going to stop there and have some discussion because that's a lot. See what you think.
I recall the controversy that existed when John F. Kennedy was running for president, and which there was, I was pretty young at the time, but the fact that he was Catholic was a major issue for a lot of people.
Yep, it was. I was 3 when he was running for president, so I only understand this from the history books. But that was a great example of, we actually had somewhat of a breakthrough because we did elect a Catholic president and we survived. Now we have our second Catholic president. And it was not even an issue really in this election that Biden was Catholic. So that's progress, because Catholicism is part of, in this country, part of our pluralistic democracy. And so that was a good first step. And there was a book written in the 50s by Will Herbert, I believe, called Protestant Catholic Jew. And it basically laid out, we need to have a country where all three of these faiths can live peacefully with one another. And that was, now we have others, right, that are growing in our country, other faiths. And we need to apply the same thing. So that's a good example.
Another example of that was that one of the criticisms of Obama, apparently a false criticism, but still there were people who suspected he was Muslim, and that was a strike against him.
Right.
So, I mean, it was not just in the distant past with JFK, but the concern
Right.
is still with us.
Yeah, and this is a deeply held belief by people, and it took various forms. In an extreme form, I had dinner with a dentist in Florida when I was pastoring there, and it was a very lovely dinner. He was trying to convince me that the church should sell him our parking lot. So, and so, of course, I told him it's not my decision as the pastor. But anyway, it was a good dinner. But then at one point, I don't even know how he got into this, but he started telling me that he started talking about Obama and how against Obama he was. And he told me that this was the theory that he had, that Obama's Kenyan brother was part of ISIS, and Obama was funneling money to ISIS through his brother. And it just hit me like I couldn't believe that an intelligent person would believe that. And I said to him, well, why would the president of the United States, and how could he do it, as with all the intelligence agencies and all the checks and balances, but why would he want to? And he was convinced that this was happening. So that's an example of kind of a fanatic nationalism that led him to that belief. And of course, this is one of the problems today, is everybody's in these information silos. And you all know what a silo is because you live in Minnesota. Not everybody knows what a silo is, but imagine that if we're all in our own silo, and your silo is oats and my silo is wheat and somebody else's silo is barley, and all we understand is barley, and we never talk to each other. What the founders wanted was multi-grain cereal, right? Not oatmeal, not plain old oatmeal, but multi-grain cereal, where we're absorbing the same information and we're filtering it through our worldview, and we're seeking in the public square to express our faith, but really realizing that it's chartered and it's plural. It's always going to be a chartered pluralism.
Randy, I think that one of the worst abuses of government authority so far as religious freedom is concerned was launched against the native populations. Because there were so many of their practices that you would call religious practices that were suppressed by law, and they weren't allowed to have the sweat lodge. They weren't allowed to do this. They weren't allowed to do that in order to, redeem the Indian. And I know very few people who are even aware or think about that.
Yeah. No, that's a great example of this. And of course, there were this goes back, this idea of exclusive faith goes back to the Pilgrims, right? They really were they really believed that they didn't believe in civic and charter pluralism. That came about through the back and forth between Thomas Jefferson, Madison, you know, all of our founding fathers, and they came up with a system of government that I think is brilliant because it understands that we have deep differences, but it doesn't say you don't have civil rights. You can't be part of civic society to a minority faith. And we are headed into a period where our faith is going to probably be a minority faith, maybe not in our lifetimes, but in this century. So we want this, right? We want to have chartered pluralism and not be in a situation like in China where they're trying to, get rid of Christianity, and they're cracking down. There was a nice period of liberalization, but it's getting much more difficult. And you see this in Hong Kong, in the churches there, and they've engaged in civil disobedience, and now that's been shut down. Okay, other
One
thoughts?
other thought, we as believers submitting to Christ, and I know that some of the concern with Catholics is submitting to the Pope, Muslims, submission to Allah, so anyone participating in our country have that value of submission to this chartered pluralism, and it is or is not a compromise for some.
Yep. No, this is great. So it's a great thing to be able to say to a Muslim, and I've had these conversations, that in our country, it's not a theocracy. And that is never the end goal, but we value you as part of our pluralistic democracy. And there are many Muslim leaders who really get this. They understand that Islam in this country is going to look different than it does in other countries. And may their tribe increase, because that is a good thing, right, for our country. And we went through this, and we have a model for it, because the Catholic Church has matured dramatically in the 20th century, so that they understand this. It's intuitive, it's built in. They don't say, we're going to do what the Pope says in our civic life in this country. They say, we're going to be Catholics, but we're going to be fellow citizens in a pluralistic democracy. And so there's a lot of good writing, and there's good writing in Islam as well, and in Judaism. So there are long traditions, but there's also these minority strains within all the religions that argue for, no, it has to be my faith, and we should be in charge.
Yeah. So Randy, when I'm a little older than you are, but as a child, way before Vatican II and before Kennedy, my father said, you don't vote for a Catholic for president or for anything, because if the Pope tells him to do something, he has to do it or he goes to hell.
Yeah.
So there's a higher authority than the Constitution over that person, and therefore that person is not qualified for public office.
Yep, that was the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it was partly true.
Yeah.
And when at some point, a Muslim might run for president, and we'll have the same argument then. And we'll have resources to have, and it's a good argument, but it's at the end of the day, we want that kind of pluralism, but we don't want a Muslim running for president that is an autocrat, right? We want them to be a part of the civic culture of this country that is our fragile democracy, which we've been talking about in the news. We want it to be a vigorous democracy with debate, But at the end of the day, we submit to the will of the majority.
I wonder on some of this may sound a little discombobulated, but history, the way it's being perceived. I look at Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist of religion, brilliant man, and he's written a number of things to defend the church against the attacks of supposedly secular Europeans and others that attacked it. For example, he talks about the Crusades. Well, they really didn't start with the Crusaders. They started with Muslims 600 years before that. Why did the Crusaders take all the blame and not the Muslims for invading all the holy places of the Bible? Then he'll talk about the Inquisition, which maybe 3,000 people died, but you still see in history books, millions of people were killed by the Inquisition. And so I said that as historical examples, but as people see their history being attacked and statues of Lincoln and Washington, all these people that we've taught to believe in being torn down and debunked, I'm afraid it's going to put people in a frame of mind to not even like the word over defend, but is it going to put us so defensive about this that we could really run into a major tug of war historically? Even Lincoln, okay, so some of his early comments sound racist and he's being judged by people's standards today. Let's tear everything down with Lincoln. Well, if you lose Lincoln, who have we got left to look up to? Washington, Jefferson, no. But so it's like one of the declines of civilization that I think it was I forgot to remember his name. I read his book back in 1941. He saw the decline of civilizations. They ran a Harvard religion sociology, I believe it was, went across the decline of civilization. He says one of those declines, in addition to the destruction of the family and so on, is the debunking of all heroes in the culture. And I think we were kind of going through that now. And again, it's not to justify for 1 second Jefferson's slave woman relationship and all that. I'm not justifying those things, but I'm just saying I think we're going to get in a real battle over our history. How do we interpret it? And it's going to be really challenging days ahead, how to have a true Christian patriotism without either a nationalism on one extreme or just a total debunking on the other.
Right. And that's that's a great example. So how does a Christian fight that battle? It's a battle worth fighting, right? To say, no, we're not going to tear down the statue of Lincoln or Washington or Grant, which has happened, right? So it's happened. And it's the same impulse. It's a fundamentalism of the left. Okay. That's leading to that. And we need to fight that, but we need to fight it with our fellow. The effective way to fight it and win it is not to say, this is a Christian nation and, you can't do that. It's to say, it's to band together with other people of other faiths and other perspectives who agree with us that we shouldn't be tearing down statues of Lincoln, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a powerful coalition. And that's what Christians have done historically is become coalition builders and not stay in their own silo. And that's how they win those democratic arguments.
Yeah.
And Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Right. He's the author of the Emancipation Proclamation. He gave his life to make this happen. He led us into a civil war to end slavery. And he was a flawed human being as well, like all of us. But we should honor him. So yeah, I think that's a good example. But at the same time, we need to listen to the reasons behind that anger, right? Because of the racism that African Americans have experienced since they were first brought here against their will. And so we need to listen to that, but I think we can find lots of people who we might disagree with on our faith who will fight that battle with us.
But I guess, and I don't want to dominate this, but you look at slavery, for example, and right away it's pointing to the America and for some European countries. I've never seen any kind of apology for slavery among Muslims, or, nobody accuses them, although they were actually, Africans enslaved Africans and sold them to the Arabs, and the Arabs sold them to the West. So, they were very much involved in it, and so I guess my point would be is how is history going to be written? Is it going to be written with some kind of objective to say, hey, well, you know what? The world since the almost beginning of time has been guilty of the slave trade, not just America since the founding of America. And just like, history, anti-Christian academics have written, all this horrendous stuff that has been done, but they very seldom will attack other places besides, unless it's a Christian place. They don't see historians attack Islam in the same way generally, at least Western historians.
Yeah.
Or they don't attack other things that have happened that are horrendous, other genocides. It just seems like there's a very concerted attack on a kind of a small segment of Christianity, as I mentioned with the example of the Inquisition. Probably the average kid reading a high school book reads about the horrible Inquisitions, and actually, my understanding of it is that the King and Queen of Spain killed far more people during a kind of a political inquisition than the church ever did. But how many people know that unless they really dig into the history? So it just seems like it's a little slanted, and I don't know how we're going to respond to that when you see our forefathers being hit, and you see all these other things attacking us. And again, it's not talking about a Christian nationalism here. Just having a balance of history is going to be really challenging the days ahead. That we have a fair perspective on this stuff. That's not all one-sided.
And I think that
I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know how to do it.
No, that's good. And I think the model in our is, I think John Inazu gives us a model. Okay, so what does he do? He's not teaching at a Christian college.
Right.
He's teaching at Washington University.
Right.
And he's having these conversations at a very high level. Now, we're not John Inazu. Okay, he's a brilliant academic mind, but he, I think, provides a model for having these conversations. And you've got to have a very robust academic center, which he's created, George Washington Carver Institute. You can look it up and see what they're doing. So what he's doing is he's not trying to, he's trying to create, and there are many others doing this in universities, they're trying to create a thoughtful Christian voice in the pluralistic environment that is winsome, that will win people over to real democracy, right? To real public square sharing of perspectives, dialogue, etc. That's a healthy democratic way for Christians to engage. And so he's doing that at that level, but we all have our circles, our networks, and we can do it at our level. And is there another option to, if we live in this is the soup that we've been thrown into, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
The other options really ends up at its end taking up arms and saying, no, we're going to make this a place that's safe for people who believe like we believe. And that is fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism or any kind of fundamentalism. Those kinds of fundamentalisms do not lead to a healthy pluralistic democracy.
I think that those kind of fundamentalisms parallel very well with what we see in the scripture in terms of the Judaizers.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible gives us a picture of someone who we are all like.
Yep.
We see if we don't see ourselves in the Jews, in their experience, we don't understand what's going on. And I think we have to always keep in mind that the fact that we have this conversation with these other religions, the fact that we have this liberty, and the fact that slavery has been declared wrong is all the yeast of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
It's been planted in the church, and the church spread throughout the world, and the seeds are spread, and so we're the ones that look bad because they can point to us and say, but you didn't live up to this, or your civilization didn't do this. Look at all the bad stuff you did. Well, ours is out there for the world to see. The others all been buried in the ground.
That's right. Yeah.
It's there, but but through us as the believers in Christ is a channel to expose the evil deeds of everyone.
Mhm.
And I don't know how the Lord's going to do that, but
But
I
that's
mean,
his
yeah,
job, right? That's his job, and it's not our job.
right.
And I think you put your finger on a very good text for us to try to think about this, and that's the book of Galatians, where Paul takes on the Judaizers. And the version of Christian faith that Paul is preaching, and at one point he has to confront Peter to his face because Peter is being co-opted by the Judaizers. And Judaizers were basically a form of religious fundamentalism. And Paul is showing a better way, the way of Christ, which is not to tell people you have to do all these rules, but it's the gospel of freedom. Um, that's a great book to study. we just finished it in our church here with the preaching pastors taking us through Galatians, so it's fresh on my mind. That's a good one.
I'm aware that some of my colleagues in Africa, Jim may know more about this because he's actually lived there, observed that in many countries in Africa, the government is controlled by people from one particular tribe. So ethnic and linguistic identity. Um, and so, I mean, that's, so we've got in our discussion, we've touched on religious identity that takes priority over, um, that dominates a political system, um, the racial things, and then these ethnic things that are based on, culture and language. So in the broader picture, then, there's this tendency that people have to away from pluralism,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
it lines up on on any of a number of different lines,
Mhm.
and sometimes the lines coincide.
Yeah. So that's a great insight, Albert. Let's call it tribalism,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's tribalism is a huge problem everywhere. Okay, look at the Balkans. Look at the history of the Balkans. That is the history of tribalism, of Serbs and all their surrounding tribes going at it for centuries. And it's true in Africa. It's true here. What we're seeing is a growth of tribalism in this country. And the antidote to tribalism is charter pluralism. And that's what governments in Africa are desperately trying to implement, but it's very difficult. Um, once tribalism becomes gets oxygen, it always leads to civil war eventually. It starts with verbal war and it ends up with shooting wars. So yeah, tribalism is the human problem. Um,
I last time I was in Kenya, I asked some of the African leaders about the last Kenya election before then, and my theory was that it was really the church that saved Kenya from civil war at that time, and the church leaders were quite ready to take responsibility and say, yeah, we did that it was the church that God used to tone down use a fire extinguisher on what was going on, and at least to bring it under control, even if that didn't necessarily bring in just an honorable government, but it stopped the violence.
no. And that's because I know Kenya the best because we lived there for a couple of months a long time ago, but and we've maintained some friendships with the Kenyans we met then. But in Kenya, you're right. Uh, the the church is the only institution where Kikuyus and Luos and Luyas can be together as brothers and sisters. So the church is the great hope for democracy. right? Because you have a place where Christians from every tribe and nation, right? Revelation
Mhm.
can gather together. That's our future, right? So let's work hard on that now. But what I see happening in the United States and what John and Nazu and others see happening is a tribalization in the church,
Mhm.
right?
Mm.
And it's the great problem with Protestantism is that once you protest and break away from the one holy Catholic, small c, and apostolic church, you just keep doing it. So there's so many different Baptist groups in this country. You know you can't possibly keep up with all of them because they keep dividing. And there's this very strong tribalist impulse everywhere it's built into our
Well, it's
very
not just
nature.
Baptists, it's Presbyterians
It's
too.
Presbyterians, right? Yes.
Yeah.
To that point,
Echo being the most recent instance of it.
Yes.
to that point, the church is that there's so many different divisions and denominations and factions that I see that the risk of a Christian nationalism, all of them galvanizing together and trying to rule the country, with one faith it seems very low to me, because I don't think they have the organization or the power. It seems to me like the risk of anti-Christian nationalism is higher
Mhm.
these days in this season. The pressure against the church to be non-Christian, or the censorship and the control of where you can worship and what you can say and what you can do, that seems to be like a bigger problem.
People.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to assimilate everything that's been said, and I've spent some time in Africa, as Albert said, and I spent since 13 years ago. I spent some time in China, back and forth, and I see the direction that they're going in China. The absolute crackdown against freedom of expression, freedom of worship in China.
Mhm.
And I've lived there a long time, and I see that we're going that direction now. It seems like we're going the wrong way.
Mhm.
Mm.
Those are my reflections.
Yeah. Well, let's get in. So InterVarsity, which is the organization I work for, I spent 17 years with InterVarsity, and left in 1996 and came back in 2018. What we've done in the last year to recognize this problem, and it's a real problem, is that we have changed our 501c3 status from a nonprofit organization to a church. Now, we did that not because we are trying to become a church and compete with churches, so don't panic. We're still a parachurch. It was done for the reason that churches have much more protection in an increasingly secular society. And what's great is that the Supreme Court has now a body of decisions that strengthen those protections for churches that are there in our Constitution, but they have been massively strengthened in the last 50 years. And it's so I'm not too concerned in the near term, because the Supreme Court is not going to go back on those decisions and start to create a society. So that's a good thing. But we need to use that freedom to worship and that freedom to assemble, etc., wisely. Okay, that's the problem. Is if we have all this protection and then we use it in a way that doesn't build consensus, we aren't going to. In other words, we have to be good civil participants, constructive participants in this pluralistic democracy that we live in.
Mm.
One of the things that I observe with friends and colleagues who are a-religious is that they fear that the religious political bloc is the biggest concern.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I observe is that each side thinks that the other side is the bigger threat
Right.
than the threat coming from their own side.
Right. And in that kind of conversation, I think we can say I think what sort of lowers the temperature is to point out these trends that are there in secular fundamentalism and in Christian fundamentalism, right? And say, we don't want those kinds of fundamentalisms to grow in strength. What we want is democracy, basically, civil conversation, and compromise over how to live together peaceably and constructively, and finding the common, working for the common good. But instead, we end up in fighting culture wars, which is that's not our job. Our job is primarily our job is to preach the gospel and lead people to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And it's when we get into putting all of our energy into culture wars or into political wars that we lose sight of that, I think.
I had an interesting example of that back when I was pastoring in inner city Chicago. I went to a pastor's conference. It was almost all African American pastors, but I was one of the few whites there. It was in a black neighborhood, and Jerry Falwell came to speak. Falwell at the time was in the center of the controversy. He was a right-wing bigot and fundamentalist, and all the ministers that went there, you could tell, were just kind of looking at him like, oh boy, this guy, what's he going to say? Mm-hmm. And Falwell did something really smart to me. I wasn't a fan of his at all. I'm in Chicago. I'm around all African Americans mostly, and so I was influenced very much by that culture, far more than I was what Jerry was involved in. Long story short, he got up and spoke. And the first thing he did was, when Dr. King appealed to us to help out with civil rights, I said, that's not the gospel. The gospel is only preaching, getting people into heaven. And I apologize deeply for that day, my brothers. I was wrong. But you guys need to really help us with this abortion issue, because abortion is killing per capita more black kids than his white kids. Mm-hmm. And by the time he got done, this guy that everyone was looking at here, what's this racist going to come to speak to us about? He had so transformed the place that they gave him a huge standing ovation. So I mean, I don't know what that has to say with exactly what our debate is, but Jerry Falwell personifies that Christian fundamentalism, Christian nationalism, at least in his day, the moral majority and all that, and a lot of that's gone south. But it's his act of contrition really just totally switched all those pastors around in one like that. So who knows what God can do if we're willing to face up to some of the things that we do have to face. And at the same time, we don't have to deny everything in our heritage. And, and that's where you almost worry about where that balance is going to be.
That overcompensation is the problem, is the bigger risk, I think. I think exactly what you say, the moral majority, all that stuff, that may have been a problem 40 years ago. Maybe in the 80s, that was a problem, that was a risk, but it never really was a problem that came to bear. I think the overcompensation now of stripping people of their freedoms and their, of their speech, I think that's a bigger problem right now.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. There's no more moral majority. It's a moral minority now, probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there probably was never a moral majority. It was probably always a minority.
Yeah.
But it was allowed. It wanted to be a majority, and maybe was the problem. It's that if our desire is not to be a majority, but our desire is to be salt and light in the world, pick your metaphor from the Gospels of how we engage in the world. But ultimately, I think what Falwell at his best was doing was building consensus that abortion is bad, and that it's basically killing African American babies at a much higher rate than any other
Mhm.
ethnic group in this country, and that that was a good argument.
Mhm.
You know, Randy, I'd like to apply this same conversation to the whole marriage issue.
Mhm.
I mean, if I, as a pastor, sign a marriage license, that's not, that's a legal document.
Right.
I wasn't called to be an agent of the state.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that if the church would declare itself and say, fine, the government can have its kind of marriage, the church will have its kind of marriage.
Mhm.
We will not sign government documents about marriage because we don't believe in that marriage.
Mhm.
If you want that marriage, you go to the state and get it.
Mhm.
But here's a piece of paper that says you were married in the eyes of for life in the eyes of God and God's people who are blessing you.
Mhm.
And we as churches would say, we'll have our kind of marriage, they can have their kind of marriage, and we're not gonna fight them on that.
Yeah.
And that would be real separation of church and state. That
Mhm.
and that would, I don't know, it just seems to me a solution.
Well, it's a brilliant solution, and it's a great example, a great case study of just what we're talking about today. So thank you for raising that, because uh, churches should not. I agree with you. Pastors shouldn't be signing civil marriage licenses, because we that's we can then define marriage as Jesus defines it, as Scripture defines it, and say we and we have lots of legal protections to do that. But when we start signing civil licenses, then anyone can come to the church and say, I want to be married here, and you're just opening yourself up. So that's a great step. I think that's, and there's some very good literature that lays that out in detail, why that is the right approach. But that's a chartered pluralistic approach. Uh, when pastors sign marriage licenses, that's kind of a holdover from, we want American to be part of Christendom, right?
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so,
Yeah,
so
in
yeah,
most countries, it doesn't work that way.
yeah, it's really easy. You just say to the couple, go get your marriage license from the county clerk. That's how it works. And don't sign it. You just have them have a notary public can sign it. A lawyer can sign. I mean, lots of you judges can sign those things. Why are pastors signing them?
Well, I
I've
think
signed them. I'm not saying I haven't done it,
I have too.
but it's not. It's not a good. I think it's a bad practice
Yeah,
in this environment. Yeah.
but yeah, I think the church should offer its own certificate
Mm-hmm.
with the pastor's signature on there.
Right.
This is a clear separation.
Yep.
And,
Like
and the church
just
should
like a
have the freedom.
baptismal. We have baptismal certificates. The marriage certificate should just be the same exact approach. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then
Jim,
if
to your point, I agree that, and the church should have the freedom to define what that means and
Exactly.
free from
Yes.
the influence of government. And now that freedom is being taken away.
that's right.
Well, not
That's
if
the
not if
problem.
we follow Philip's approach, though. It's not being taken away.
That's why I'm agreeing with them. I think to me, the problem, the root of the problem is the loss of liberty.
Yeah.
And there's too much power in the government to prescribe what you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there's one added advantage here. So if we have our own marriage, a gay couple comes to our church, they've been born again in the Spirit, they've come to know Jesus. We can recognize God's work in their life, but they say, hey, we've been together for 20 years. And we feel that we should stay together now. You know, let each one remain in the state where he was when he was called. They would come with. Or the polygamous man in Africa comes, I've got 6 wives, but I've come to Christ. How do the Africans handle that? Well, they are accepted.
Yep.
But you don't ask him to be the pastor.
Yeah. There you go.
Right.
Barbara.
And see, if we had that kind of system, we could
next,
make it
Barbara.
really clear. Everybody's welcome here, but here are the requirements for leadership.
Yep. Yep. Barbara.
And
Yeah, I just want, so what we're saying is that there should be separation of church and state.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what we're saying. It's in the
Summary.
Constitution.
And it provides some clarity here.
Yes.
And I appreciate Philip's contributions, Pastor
Right.
Philip's contributions, because it's giving clarity. And
Yeah.
I think that this is probably the best route to go.
Well,
And then the sharing then should be free, because we have the personal rights to talk to anybody we want to talk to.
Mhm.
And so it sort of takes it from government suppression to personal freedom of sharing with anybody you want to share.
Freedom to assemble,
Yeah.
freedom to worship. Those are First Amendment rights, and we should pursue them fully. But I mean, this is a great example that you're surfacing here of how do you live in this chartered pluralistic environment. So anyway, I recommend that you read the whole book, Confident Pluralism. It's not a dry academic book. It's actually very readable for a non-political scientist. He wrote it in that way, even though it's built on very careful high standards academic research.
Hmm.
Okay, how are we doing on time?
10:36, so 10:45, we should be wrapping up and praying, and 10:50 is a hard stop.
Okay, well, let me just say that, so next week, we're gonna look at what some people have called collective narcissism. And we're gonna talk about we're gonna get very practical. How do you talk to someone who's in that silo? And how do you it might be a fellow Christian, or it could be someone in a different silo, but how do you understand what's going on in their mind and heart and actually have a conversation? Because you might have a family member in that situation, or a friend or a colleague, and we're going to get very practical. So that's what we're going to do next week. But let's wrap up today. Any other comments, questions, lingering things?
I don't remember all the details, but reading how in France currently there's a lot of discussion with the relationship of church and state because of radical Muslims, evangelical Christians, and that with their law moving forward could be more constraining on Christians, but yet wanting to integrate Muslims. So I don't remember any details about it though.
Yeah, and France is a good example of how they're having a huge problem. It's true in all over Europe, but France is sort of on the point of the spear, because in France they have this doctrine of a state church, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and they're experiencing that now because of the huge Muslim immigration, and it just doesn't work. So they should go to a chartered pluralist democracy. They have those elements, right, in France, right? They're a democracy, but the state church thing is really causing huge problems all over Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going back to Bob Brenneman's comments about history and not rewriting history per se, but as I look at young adults, grade school, junior high, high school, college, and the education, how to carefully have that critical thinking to evaluate the whole picture regarding that we have flaws as we look at it from our own perspectives, and how do you have that conversation? Because clearly there is philosophies that are coming out quite clearly.
Well, I think this is a tough one, because when our kids were in high school, they went to Berkeley High School, because we lived in Berkeley, California. And Berkeley was one of the pioneers of teaching kind of a radical, basically radicalism to high school students, and it's a form of brainwashing.
Yeah.
Okay, and now it's happening it's in every school district, and that's why there's a huge fight in school districts. So what I did, this is what I did, and what Carrie and I did, is when they were in junior high, we actually read together a book called The Universe Next Door by Jim Sire, which we used to give to
I read
college
it.
freshmen
Yeah.
to introduce them to all the different worldviews that they would encounter in college and university. But we figured out, and this was our kids are 30 and 35, so this was a while ago, but it was in Berkeley. Remember that?
Yeah.
But what we did is we said, we got to read this now. And we basically inoculated them against this worldview challenge that they would face in high school. And it was fascinating to watch. They would come home, they had a required course in ethnic studies. And we said, boy, this is great. And we would look at it with them and talk about it with them, because we wanted them to learn about other ethnic groups. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it became a kind of more, I would call it social or even communist, the ideology that was being taught by the teachers was not helpful, right? It wasn't building chartered pluralism. It wasn't building respect for all ethnic groups. It was sort of building in hatred, and they saw this.
Really?
It was really interesting. And so how do they come out? Well, they both care deeply about justice. They cared. They march on Martin Luther King. They do all sorts of great stuff. So they got some great stuff, and they got a deep foundation in Jesus, who believes in justice too, right? So I think that's kind of, I mean, it's an imperfect example like all of our examples, but that's kind of how we live in this environment.
Yeah, because I listened to my granddaughters in California and what their history and the philosophies, and to think critically from a different perspective or worldview is challenging.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend named Mike Shudd, who was the national director of the Christian Legal Society, and he's decided to leave that position and work with a high school ministry, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it's basically a worldview academy. So it's taking Jim Sire's book and what we did to a much higher level, where basically you have to take Christian students through a whole worldview academy, and they have summer courses and prepare them to live in a pluralistic society. And I think that's one of the ways the church can shape the next generation. That's what Bonhoeffer says. The problem in Germany was cheap grace. The problem was a lack of discipleship. We've got to disciple mind, heart, soul, and spirit. And mind is what this stuff goes after. So, it's not easy. It's not going to be easy. It's much nicer if we live in a Christian country and everybody agrees with us, right? But that's really never existed, for one thing. And I don't see it existing in the future. So we got to get ready for living in this pluralistic world, and then basically argue with others for chartered pluralism, for fairness, for protection of minority viewpoints, and those sorts of things. And we can find a lot of common ground, because everybody's going to be a minority viewpoint
Right.
It's going to become more multi-ethnic, our country, and more worldview diverse.
So is Jim Seidler the person that
Jim
did Calvary?
Sire, Jim Sire, the Universe Next Door.
Oh, okay. He's the author of.
It's
how do
a
you spell the
very
last name?
basic Yeah, it's a very basic book. It's still in print. It's one of the biggest sellers that the University Press has ever. It's an older book, but
It's
he's
good. I
How do
remember.
you spell the
Yeah.
last name?
Sire is S-I-R-E.
Can I make
Jan
one
Sire.
on a country level? I saw this in Turkey. In the past, when Turkey was secularizing, as it has been since the 30s, anything to do with the old Ottoman Empire was kind of looked down on, and they were backwards. Even some of the cultures of the water pipe and all these things were kind of disdained. And then Turkey's gone through this Islamic transformation to some degree now, and they're bringing that and glorifying in the Ottoman Empire. It was so wonderful then, and everybody was fair and just, and they've gone to the extreme how whole countries have been transformed according to the ideology that the government wants to push. And so, you wonder if America is going to go, we went through the, different phases, and it's going to be interesting, like you said, Randy, if we don't see Christ in some way, transforming and helping the church to do this, we're going to look at a worldview before long that anything to do with our heritage, anything to do with Christianity is just going to be disgraced as nothing but homophobic, racist, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying none of it was, it obviously was, but it's going to be so one-sided that that's where we need us to be that salt and light and really see a real narrative. Because I mean, it's been night and day difference, of course, in one country from shaming of the past to glorifying the past. And so it can definitely happen. And of course, you mentioned China as an example of the way it's going right now. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the days ahead in our own country, how we're going to look at our history and how we're going to look at our heritage and keeping a perspective of, that it's going to be interesting, put it that way. I'll leave it at that.
And it's 10:46.
Well, great to be with you all, and look forward to next week when we
And
get,
Albert, you would like to pray when we're done?
Yes,
and then
Just suggesting it.
let's go to that, Albert.
let's go.
Let's go
Let's
to
do.
prayer.
Oh, Father,
ahead.
we do thank you, Father, for the chance to think about these things, and we'd ask for your guidance and your wisdom and courage to live out who we are as Christians, but also to be respectful of others with whom we disagree, and especially not to make an idol out of Christianity, because we need to look to you first, and your commands and your concern for all people, and not wall ourselves off into just um, one narrow group of people. So, Lord, teach us how to walk this difficult path um, in keeping you first in our lives, keeping
Yes,
your
Lord.
faith, your teachings, your scriptures first in our lives, and to live that out in our relationship with all people.
Hmm.
Amen.
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 Well, great to see you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bless
you,
you.
Randy.
Thank
God
Bless
bless
you.
thank you,
everybody.
Randy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.